Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're going to be continuing on with the Ford F250 build. We made good progress. We got the chassis put together, the tires, wheels, and most of the bed completed. Now we're going to get working on the cab so we can get that finished up. Alright, so let's get started. I'm starting out this build by cutting supports off the grill insert. I've come a long way in designing for 3D prints, but I still have way more to go. I was able to get a lot of the design figured out, but for some of the more complicated sections, it was just too complicated for me. I have plans on learning how to figure this out. It just takes time. For now, I just got as close as possible, and I manually carved the rest with a rotary tool. I'm not sure why, but I tend to start at the back of the cab. I suppose it's easier to start with more of a flatter shape than one that is more curved, like say the fenders or hood. After I get the basic shape, styrene is added to build up the area below the window. When I have detailed, shallow items, it's much easier to add in material than remove it. Once I get the shape transferred over and cut out, the piece gets glued into place. If necessary, filler is used to smooth out the transitions. An additional piece was cut out and attached to the glued-on styrene piece. Most of the time, just one will do, but this required multiple pieces. I've tried several ways to cut out a window, but the best is to make a thin cut line in the mold. I can go back and clean this line up with multiple different shaped rotary tool cutters. Once I have the shape complete, I need to define the places which need to be cut and the door openings. I'm trying a new thing here by defining the door openings in the mold. In the past, I cut these out afterwards using a scribe tool. This works really well, but it tends to give more of a 2D look. What I'm trying is more of a defined 3D feel for the door openings. I accomplish this by using a small cutoff wheel, which is spun up by my rotary tool. There isn't much cleanup required, but I need to get the lower section cut out and take time to match the opening up with the bed. The bed required a lot of thought to get the dimensions cut down for a shorter wheelbase of the VS410. The front was not modified though. I took the scaled up drawing and transferred the shape to a piece of MDF. This was then taken to my benchtop sander to start to get the shape sorted out. In the past, I tried to get the shape as close as possible to the belt sander. Now I just get it close and refine the shape with the Dremel Multimax tool and sandpaper. Another good tool for shaping is the rotary tool. I use a Proxxon, but for years I used Dremel. The Proxxon is much smaller and lighter, which makes it easier to hold and get clearly defined shapes. The downside is the power isn't as much as the Dremel. However, the smoothness makes up for the lack of power. You can get much cleaner and better shapes with a smoother rotary tool. Much like the rear cab section, I use styrene pieces on the side mold. This is the area at the bottom of the body which flares out slightly. This shape is easily made with styrene and a little filler to make the transition. The window openings were also cut into the piece, much like the door openings. I am looking for a more defined shape coming from the mold. The more I deal with vacuum forming, the more I realize that spending the time up front can really pay dividends when you're making multiples later on. I was really happy with how these molds worked out. I go back and forth with making full pieces versus making fenders and cab pieces. Since the sides and fenders were in the same plane, it made sense to keep this as one. Taking the time to cut in the windows and door openings also really helped with the final look. Once I got the piece from the mold, it was added to the rear cab section. I make the transitions by adding in thin strips of styrene over the seam. I do my best to think ahead of where the seams are placed. If I can, they are positioned away from natural seams, such as door openings. I do this to keep the seam as strong as possible. Most of the time the door opening is defined later on with the scribe tool. This tool works much better if the material is consistent. Having the seam just makes it more difficult to get a consistent recess. Up until this point, the pieces are still pretty floppy. By adding in a piece, which will later define the engine bay, the pieces start to take shape. This is why it's critical to check and double check for squareness. I've had to backtrack a few times. This is not fun at all, since it means a lot of cutting and fill-in work to get you back to where you were when you first started. The last piece to tie in all the side panels is the lower valance, below the grille. Since I want the grille to be bolted in, I need to make the lower section really help define the shape. My first attempt at the grille had the center section a little too wide. I was able to shorten it up a bit, but it's still just maybe like a millimeter or two wider than I really want. It's not bad enough to go back and change, but it makes it critical to get the front edge just right. The ends of the grille is where most of the change occurs. Due to the size of my 3D printer, I had to print the grille in 3 pieces. These were then glued back together and the seams blended with CA and filler. In order to have a thick enough area to screw into, dams were built up from styrene and filled with chunks of styrene and CA glue. I thought about using a plastic epoxy, but I have found that styrene and CA really do hold the screw well. All I need to do is sand back the area before I screw the pieces in and get it ready to be attached to the body. I also had to trim away some of the front to accommodate the lights for the grille. These lights are made up of aluminum funnels, Tamiya headlights. These lights are made up of aluminum funnels and a Tamiya headlight. When I was making the end of the grille in Fusion 360, I utilized an existing file to hold the funnel and lens. This is one of the really nice features of Fusion 360. I can take an existing known file and incorporate it into a new one. Once I have the placement correct and all the parts fit, I drill holes and mount up the grille. Doing this allows me to make small adjustments to the grille without worrying about having to hold it perfectly in place by hand. There's still a lot to sort out with the grille, but I moved on to the pop-up tent. I prefer to keep moving through the process instead of taking each and every step to completion. Oftentimes, one will need to go back and modify a step, and it's better to do so when it's half complete versus fully complete. The tent, which is from Knight Customs, was sliced into 4 files and then glued back together once printed. It depends on the size and shape of the piece, but if I can add strips along the side to reduce the amount of material needed in a mold versus having the entire thing solid. The shape of the hood is a bit tricky, but not too bad. I first used my benchtop sander to rough up the general shape. I need to be very careful with this since I plan on making the hood open. As mentioned before, having proper panel lines with a functioning part is much more difficult than one that's glued into place. I needed to have a raised section going down the front. In the past, I would have measured out each side, but I have now switched to drawing one side and then folding it in half. It's a bit quicker and a lot more accurate. This transition piece carries back to the windshield cowl, so I made one larger piece and then cut it down to fit. A little CA glue was placed along the edges before finishing it off with some dolphin glaze filler. Just like on the rear of the cab, multiple pieces of styrene were used to get the desired effect. Once you have the styrene glued to the wood, solvents can be used since you are making styrene to styrene connections. Once again, some dolphin glaze was mixed up and placed on the edges before sanding it back to its final shape. I was happy with how well the pieces came out of the vacuum molds. It only took a small amount of adjustment to get the windshield cowl to fit. This is a very critical piece since the shape of the windshield opening can make or break the build. There's only one piece of the cab puzzle left. That piece is the roof. It doesn't take much work on the benchtop sander to get this piece into shape. I'm doing my best to allow room to place the mold against the part of the truck I'm trying to create. In the past, I didn't pay close enough attention to this and sometimes had to make a lot of measurements instead of just marking the line with a pencil as it's being held up to the existing part. I try my best to get good connections with the roof panels, but there are always small gaps. There's also going to be inconsistencies with the angles where the pieces are meeting up. So I start off with CA glue and then move to dolphin glaze filler. The dolphin glaze is generally spread over areas that might not need it, but by doing this and sanding back, you end up with a much smoother piece. The more you can do to make it smooth in the mold, the less processing is required. After a quick coat of primer is applied, I sanded back the area around the roof so I could apply the drip rail. I have found that having any panel glued to primer can end up popping off later. It is much better to glue straight to the plastic. With the cab mostly intact, I switched my focus to the mounts needed to hold both the body and the electronics. For this, I am mostly using 1/16 inch aluminum angle. You can find this in various sizes, but I do my best to keep some of every size on hand. A simple battery tray is made at the rear of the cab. My intent is to get a 5,000 milliamp LiPo in this truck, so I need to use the space under the bench seat. These old builds with their bench seats do come in handy for that. I've tried several different methods for having a hinge hood in the past. What works well is to make a hinge from aluminum angle and then bolt it to another angle piece. It takes careful measurement to get it right, but at the end I find it works well. This time I used a set of hinges designed and printed by my friend Tandem C Television. He used these hinges on his Gremlin build and ended up sending me a set. I have to say that this is by far the best set of hinges I have ever used. To mount them, I just needed to add material on the hood as well as the windshield cowl. This material gives a spot where a screw can be sunk in to hold the hinges in place. The firewall needed a pretty large hole for the hinges to clear, but that was accomplished quickly with my rotary tool. It would be nice if the hole could be a little bit smaller, but the larger hole is an acceptable sacrifice for having such a well-working hinge. What I did here was take some M4 screws and drilled a small hole crosswise at the end of the screw. These are then sanded back so that it has two parallel flat spots. The screw is mounted to the cab and the corresponding hole is drilled into the bed. Once in place, a small body clip can be used to prevent the screw from being pulled out. I'm really excited about this build and look forward to taking it to the next level. Until then, I'll see you in the rocks.